My father looked me in the eyes 2 weeks before he died and told me I was the strongest person he had ever known. I held his hand in that hospital room, paid for by my own credit card, and I believed him. What I did not know was that the night before, he had signed a new will leaving everything to my brother Daniel, the man who had not held a steady job in 11 years and had borrowed money from our parents so many times that my mother had stopped writing it down. I found out about the will at the reading, sitting in a law office that smelled like old paper and bad news, watching Daniel try to suppress a smile while the attorney read out that the family home, the savings account, and every asset my father had accumulated over a lifetime were going entirely to my older brother as recognition for his loyalty and presence during the final chapter of our father's life. I sat very still and said absolutely nothing. I signed the documents I needed to sign, shook the attorney fan, and walked out into the afternoon sun feeling like the ground had shifted permanently beneath my feet. For 15 years, I had paid for every single medical bill my father accumulated. Every specialist, every surgery copay, every physical therapy session, every hospital parking ticket, every prescription that insurance would not cover. I had driven 4 hours round trip every single weekend for the last 3 years to sit with him, fix things around the house, manage his medications, coordinate with his doctors, and make sure he was not alone. Daniel visited 4 times in 3 years. 4 times. And 2 of those visits were for holidays, where my mother cooked everything and Daniel showed up with a bottle of cheap wine and left before the dishes were done. The will called it loyalty. I called it something else entirely. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because the will was not an accident or a sudden decision. It was the final chapter of a story that had been written long before my father got sick. Daniel was always the chosen one. Growing up, my parents treated him like a rare and fragile gift that needed constant protection from the ordinary demands of life. When Daniel failed his driving test 3 times, my father laughed and called him a free spirit. When I failed a single math test in 7th grade, my mother sat me down for a 45-minute conversation about discipline and potential. When Daniel dropped out of college after 1 semester to pursue what he called a music career, my parents funded his apartment for 2 years and told everyone at family gatherings that he was finding himself. When I put myself through a 4-year degree working nights at a grocery store, my father shook my hand at graduation and told me he always knew I was self-sufficient enough to handle it alone. That phrase became the justification for everything. I was self-sufficient. I did not need help. I could handle it. The subtext was always the same. Daniel needed nurturing because he was sensitive and special, and I needed nothing because I had made the catastrophic mistake of being competent. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had started my own construction company with $12,000 I had saved over 3 years. No loans from my parents, no safety net, no backup plan. I built it from a single truck and a tool belt into a company with 18 employees and contracts across 3 counties. My parents came to my office exactly once. My father looked around, nodded twice, and said it looked like things were going well for me. Daniel called me 2 days later to ask if I could put him on payroll since he was between things again. I said no. That was the first time I had ever said no to him directly, and the silence on the other end of the line was something I still think about. The years between that phone call and my father's diagnosis were mostly quiet on the family front. I focused on building my business. Daniel floated from scheme to scheme while quietly draining my parents whenever he needed a cushion, and my parents maintained their careful fiction that everything was balanced and fair. I know now that during that period, my father transferred over $40,000 to Daniel across various loans that were never repaid and never discussed with me. I know because I found the bank statements 2 months after the funeral when my mother finally broke down and showed them to me, crying and saying she had never wanted any of it to happen this way. The diagnosis came when my father was 68. a degenerative neurological condition that would progressively take more and more of his independence. The doctors were honest about the trajectory. It was not a question of if, only of when and how fast. My father called both of us to tell us together. Daniel cried loudly and dramatically for about 10 minutes, then asked if the condition was hereditary because he was worried about his own health. I sat with my father for 4 hours after that call, making lists, researching specialists, calling his insurance company, and building a care plan that would keep him comfortable and safe for as long as possible. That was the beginning of 3 years that cost me over $90,000 out of my own pocket. I never asked my parents to reimburse me. I never presented a bill or kept a running total out loud. I paid because he was my father, and because someone had to, and because Daniel's contribution to the care plan was promising to call every Sunday, a promise he kept for approximately 6 weeks before the calls dropped to once a month and then to almost never.
I want to be specific about what those 3 years actually looked like, because I think people hear the phrase, "I took care of my father," and imagine something soft and manageable. This was not soft. This was brutal, grinding, exhausting work that I did in parallel with running a company and trying to maintain some version of a personal life. I drove 4 hours round trip every single weekend without missing one. I coordinated with 3 different specialist offices across 2 cities. I managed his medication schedule through 2 significant changes that required careful titration and weekly check-ins with his neurologist. When his condition progressed to the point where he needed home modifications, I personally oversaw the installation of grab bars, ramp access, and a stair lift. I paid for a part-time home health aide 4 days a week because my mother's own health was declining and she could not manage his care alone. I attended every major medical appointment, took notes, asked the questions he could no longer formulate clearly, and translated the answers into language my mother could understand and act on. I missed my company's largest contract signing to be in the hospital when he had a fall that fractured his wrist. I missed my own birthday twice. I was there, consistently, reliably, exhaustingly there. Daniel sent flowers once. They arrived 2 days late, and the card had the wrong name on it. My father propped it up on his nightstand anyway because he wanted so badly to believe that both of his sons were showing up for him. I never said a word about the flowers. I just kept driving. The week my father died was the hardest week of my life. And also the clearest. I was with him when it happened, sitting in the chair next to his bed at 3 in the morning because I had learned to read the signs that his breathing was changing. My mother was asleep in the next room. Daniel was 4 hours away and had texted that morning to say he was planning to drive up that weekend. My father passed quietly, without drama, in a room that smelled like the lavender spray my mother used on his pillow every evening. I sat with him for a while before I called anyone. I called the hospice nurse first, then my mother, then Daniel. Daniel arrived 6 hours later, red-eyed and visibly shaken, and immediately became the center of every conversation about grief in the house for the next 3 days. Relatives I had not seen in years told me how hard this must be for Daniel, how sensitive he had always been, how much he had clearly loved his father. I stood in my childhood home, having just spent 3 years and $90,000 keeping that man alive and comfortable, and I smiled and agreed that yes, Daniel was taking it very hard. The funeral arrangements fell to me because my mother was not in a state to manage them, and Daniel said planning made him anxious. I chose the flowers, coordinated with the funeral home, wrote the obituary, and organized the reception. At the reception, Daniel gave a speech about his bond with our father that lasted 11 minutes and made several people cry. I spoke for 3 minutes and talked about my father's hands, how strong they were when I was small, how I had watched them change over 3 years and tried to make sure they were always warm. Nobody cried at my speech. I think I preferred it that way. The will reading happened 4 days after the funeral.
I had no particular expectations walking in. My father had never discussed his estate plans with me directly, and I had never asked because it felt crass to think about money in the middle of caring for someone dying. What I knew was that the family home was paid off, my father had a modest savings account, and there were a few small investment accounts that had grown quietly over the decades. The attorney read through the preliminary language, the boilerplate about sound mind and legal execution, and then got to the substance. Everything went to Daniel. The house, the savings, the investments, the personal property. Everything. The language in the will described Daniel as having demonstrated unwavering presence and emotional support during a profoundly difficult chapter of the family's life. It described the bequest as a recognition of that loyalty and devotion. I sat completely still through the entire reading. My mother would not look at me. Daniel kept his eyes on the attorney's desk. I signed the acknowledgement documents, confirmed I had no contest to file, and stood up. Daniel caught my arm on the way out and said that he hoped I understood and that Dad always knew I was the strong one who did not need it. I looked at him for a long moment. I told him I understood completely. I meant something entirely different than what he thought I meant. I drove home, sat in my car in my driveway for about 20 minutes, and made a decision. I was done. Done with the phone calls, done with the holidays, done with the performance of being part of a family that had spent 40 years treating my competence as an excuse to give me nothing. I blocked their numbers, declined every invitation, and redirected my energy entirely toward my own life. For 2 years, I heard nothing and said nothing. I was, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely at peace. What I did not tell anyone was that 6 months after the will reading, I had started quietly monitoring the property tax records on the family home. I did this not out of malice, but out of a calm, practical certainty that Daniel would not be able to hold on to a property that required consistent financial responsibility. I had watched him operate for decades. He burned through money with a specific kind of cheerful recklessness, always convinced the next thing would be the thing that changed everything, always surprised when it wasn't. The house my father left him was worth around $320,000 in the current market and carried annual property taxes of just over $6,000. Not an enormous sum, but an absolutely reliable one that arrived on the same schedule every single year without negotiation or flexibility. Within 14 months of inheriting the house, Daniel had liquidated the savings account, cashed out the investment accounts, and, from what I could piece together through public records and quiet conversations with one cousin who still spoke to me, spent the majority of it on a business venture involving cryptocurrency infrastructure that collapsed almost immediately. By month 18, the property tax account was showing a delinquent balance. By month 20, the county had issued a formal notice of tax sale. I watched the listing appear in the public auction database on a Tuesday morning while I was eating breakfast. I finished my coffee, called my attorney, and placed a bid. I did not tell a single person. The auction closed on a Thursday. I became the legal owner of my childhood home on a cold Friday morning in November for $41,000 in back taxes and auction fees, a fraction of its actual value, as is standard in a tax delinquency sale. I stood outside it for a few minutes after the paperwork cleared, looking at the front door, and felt absolutely nothing except a quiet sense of completion. Daniel called me on a Sunday. I had unblocked his number 2 weeks earlier, specifically because I had a feeling the call was coming and I wanted to be available to receive it. When his name appeared on my screen, I let it ring 4 times before I answered. His voice was different from the last time I had heard it. The easy confidence was completely gone, replaced by something thin and slightly desperate that I recognized as the sound of someone who had finally run out of options. He started with small talk, asking how I was doing, how the business was going, mentioning the weather. I answered briefly and waited. After about 3 minutes of circling, he got to the point. He said that he had made some mistakes with the money and that the house had gotten away from him, and that he was in a situation where he needed some help figuring out his next steps. He asked if we could meet in person to talk through some options. I told him I was open to meeting. I suggested the family home as a location, mentioned I knew it well, and that it might be a comfortable place to have a difficult conversation. He agreed without hesitation, clearly still believing he had some standing there. We scheduled the meeting for the following Saturday morning. I arrived first, used my key, and was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee when Daniel knocked and then immediately tried his key in the lock. It did not work because I had changed the locks the week I took ownership. I walked to the door and opened it myself. The look on his face when I opened that door is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I invited him in, and we sat at the same kitchen table where we had eaten 1,000 childhood meals and where my father had signed documents that changed the course of both our lives. Daniel looked around the house with the expression of someone who is trying to orient themselves in a space that no longer feels the way it should. He noticed small things first. A different throw blanket on the couch, a new plant on the windowsill, a stack of mail on the counter addressed to my name. He looked at me and asked if I had been staying here. I told him that I lived here now. I watched the information travel across his face in stages. Confusion first, then a slow realization, then something that looked almost like admiration before it collapsed into panic. He asked me how that was possible. I told him about the tax auction, about the delinquent notices I had tracked, about the bid I had placed, about the paperwork that had closed 6 months earlier. I told him that the home our father left him in recognition of his loyalty and devotion was now mine, purchased legally and properly at a fraction of its value because he had failed to pay $6,000 a year in property taxes while spending $200,000 on a failed cryptocurrency scheme. He sat very quietly for a long time. Then he asked what he was supposed to do now. I told him that was genuinely a good question, and that he should take some time to think carefully about the answer. He asked if I was going to help him. I reminded him of something he had said to me in a law office 2 years earlier. I told him I had always been the strong one who did not need anything, which meant he had always been the one who needed help, which meant the pattern of this family had never actually been about fairness. It had been about who could be relied upon to absorb the consequences of other people's choices without complaint. I told him I was no longer available for that role. Daniel tried several approaches over the next hour. He started with guilt, reminding me that this was our childhood home, that our father had grown up in this house, that it was sacred family ground that deserved to stay in the family name. I told him it was in the family name. Mine. He shifted to appeals for compassion, explaining that he had genuinely tried with the business, that the market had moved against him, that anyone could make a financial mistake, and that family was supposed to catch you when you fell. I told him that I had spent 3 years and $90,000 catching our father when he fell, and the family's response to that had been to give everything to the person who sent flowers with the wrong name on the card. He tried anger next, telling me that what I had done was predatory, that I had waited for him to fail and swooped in like a vulture to take what should have been a family asset. I agreed that I had waited, and pointed out that waiting and watching is exactly what he had done for 3 years, while I drove 4 hours every weekend and paid every bill. The anger collapsed quickly because he did not actually have a foundation to stand on, and some part of him knew it. What was left after the guilt and the appeals and the anger was just a tired, middle-aged man sitting at a kitchen table in a house he no longer owned, trying to figure out how the story of his life had arrived at this particular chapter. I felt something for him in that moment. Not enough to change anything, but something. I told him that I was not going to put him on the street immediately. I told him he had 60 days to make alternative arrangements, that I would not charge him rent for those 60 days, and that after that the house was mine to do with as I chose. Daniel left that afternoon without saying much. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street. I made myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat at the table for a long time, looking at the room around me. This was the kitchen where my father had taught me to make his mother's bread recipe on winter Saturdays when I was 8 years old. This was the room where my mother had cried the night she got his diagnosis, and I had sat with her for 2 hours saying nothing because there was nothing useful to say. This was the table where a lawyer had once read out a document that told me my 15 years of showing up had been classified as self-sufficiency rather than devotion, and that devotion apparently looked like Daniel's 4 visits and a bouquet of flowers with the wrong name. I owned this room now. I owned these walls and this window and the view of the backyard where my father had planted a cherry tree the year I was born that was still standing, a little overgrown, but still standing, still producing fruit every spring regardless of who was paying attention to it. My father told me once that the strongest things in the world are not the ones that make the most noise. He was talking about construction materials at the time, comparing steel to concrete, but I stored it away because it felt like it meant something larger. I think he was right. I think he always knew I was strong in the way that actually matters, not the kind of strength that gets celebrated at family dinners, but the kind that keeps showing up quietly, year after year, without needing anyone to notice. He was also wrong about one thing. He thought that kind of strength meant I did not need anything. What he missed was that not needing something and not deserving it are 2 entirely different things. I deserved this house. I just had to wait long enough to earn it back.